Why tongues are not language. People who speak in tongues believe them to be a true language, perhaps not one spoken on earth, but a language nonetheless. A question frequently asked by tongue speakers is, how do you know tongues are not a language, heavenly, angelic, or otherwise? That's a great question, but one that definitely does not have a quick and easy answer. There is much that can be and has been written on this subject. I have tried to summarize an answer as best and concisely as possible. At the risk of sounding blunt, for a linguist, real languages, whether currently spoken or long dead, are almost always immediately recognizable as such. By this I mean that it may take a little bit to identify the actual specific language, but it will nonetheless be recognized as real, rational language. When it comes to tongue speech, this simply does not happen. In fact, it does not happen with any type of glossolalia, whether spoken by a Christian here in the US or an Evenki shaman in Siberia. Let me set a backdrop of sorts. When it comes to tongue speech, some people are quick to tell me that I'm trying to explain or understand the spiritual in earthly terms, or something along those lines, or that there are thousands of languages in the world. How can you possibly know that tongues is not one of these, whether ancient or modern, living or dead? Well, there are many intangible things in religion that must be taken solely on faith alone. They cannot be proven, nor can they be disproven. Tongues, however, is not one of these things. It is something very tangible, something very physical. Tongues can be, and have been, examined, analyzed, and studied, with all results yielding essentially the same conclusions. No matter how you slice and dice it, modern tongues are simply not language. So the questions are, how can you say that? What makes modern tongues not language? The simple answer is relatively straightforward. If a person or being produces a stream of speech, in order for it to be language, regardless of whether spoken in front of you, in some remote corner of the world, on some alien planet, or on some heavenly or spiritual plane of existence, to be language, at its most basic level, it must contain at a minimal two features. 1. Discrete units of various sorts, and 2. Rules and principles that govern the way these discrete units can be combined and ordered. I can't stress this enough, but these two features are universal, regardless of where or by whom the speech is being produced. As we shall see, tongue speech contains neither one of these features. It is simply a facade of language. Neither, by the way, is modern tongues or glossolalia gibberish. Gibberish does not seek to mimic language. Glossolalia does. To delve deeper into this and give the long answer with kind of a mini lesson in linguistics to boot, when discussing what makes up language, there are a number of factors one must consider. Let's start with one of the easier ones, phonology. Phonology, when speaking about a particular language, concerns itself with the underlying sounds found in that given language. Phonology also defines what is allowed and disallowed in a given language with respect to how these sounds are put together. In addition, suprasegmental elements, that is, things like stress, accent, pitch, and tone, are also considered. With tongues, hereafter I refer to as T-speech, phonology is unique to the phenomenon. That is, a speaker's T-speech will usually only contain those sounds found in that speaker's native language. The sounds of a person's T-speech may also contain those found in other languages with which the speaker is familiar or has had contact with either actively or passively. This is something that's frequently overlooked and leads people to think that because some sounds produced do not occur in the speaker's native language, that the speaker's T-speech must be a legitimate language of some kind. Further, even within that set of sounds, called a phonemic inventory, a tongue will typically only contain a select smaller number, that is, a subset, of those sounds. Typically, this subset consists of sounds in a given phonemic inventory that are easier, physiologically speaking, to produce in the vocal tract than the ones that are excluded. For example, it's much easier to produce a sh sound than it is to produce a j sound. The sh does not require as great a deal of effort to produce as the j sound. The direct result of the above is that no two tongues will ever sound or be the same, ever. There are as many different tongues as there are speakers of tongues. What is also found in T-speech, which seems to detract it from being anything that is divine in nature, is that any disallowed combinations of sounds in the speaker's native language, and those he or she is also familiar with, will also be disallowed in the speaker's T-speech. For the most part, accent, tone, word stress, etc. will usually echo the speaker's native language. However, it's also quite common for a speaker to adopt a particular style or manner of speaking which is different from his or her everyday speech. Could be, a lower, a higher, or altered voice, speaking more quickly or slowly, etc. This is just a way to make the T-speech sound more foreign or unlike the speaker's native language. So, to summarize, as a result of all the above processes, a speaker's T-speech will never contain a different, unique phonemic inventory specific to that tongue. We are simply dealing with a subset of the sounds found in the speaker's native language, typically containing the easiest sounds to produce physiologically. As an example, a speaker of American English who has never had contact with another language, which is pretty rare, but for the sake of argument, will never produce T-speech containing the click sounds found in some languages of Southern Africa, or the double L sound of Welsh, or the U umlaut sound of German. One curious thing that American speakers tend to do concerns the R sound. Rather than produce the typical American R, as in red, they will either turn it into a single flap, like the T in most people's pronunciation of water, or they'll produce a trilled R as found in various European languages. Why is this done? Well, again, it makes the T-speech more foreign sounding, more unlike the speaker's native language. All of the above said, the simple fact that tongues do not contain any unique sounds not found in the speaker's own language cannot be the sole defining factor of whether you have an actual language or not. Other factors also need to be considered. Syllable structure may be taken into account, but really only marginally. Typically, the syllables of T-speech are simplified to an all-open pattern. That is, they consist of consonant plus vowel, despite the fact that the speaker's native language can contain closed syllables, consonant, vowel, consonant. T-speech can contain a consonant, vowel, consonant pattern, but typically the last consonant closing the syllable will be one of the easier to produce physiologically from the subset of phonemes used for the particular tongue. But again, the fact that syllable structure of T-speech is simplified from the speaker's own does not constitute non-language. There are plenty of languages in the world that have this type of open syllable structure. Polynesian languages come immediately to mind, for example. The main defining factor for most linguists with respect to T-speech as non-language utterance is the glossic elements, or words themselves. When referring to T-speech, the term word is somewhat flexible. Indeed, the term glossic element would be more accurate. Most linguists will divide a glossic string into words based upon the speaker's pauses and stops during their speaking, just like you would with a real language. What do I mean by the words themselves? Well, let me try and explain. Every language contains something called morphemes. These are the smallest meaningful units in a given language. Morphemes come in two flavors, free and bound. As an example, let's take the word players. This word contains three morphemes, one free and two bound. Play is a verb. It describes an action. It also is a free morpheme as it can stand alone as a word all by itself. The ER is a morpheme as well, and it creates a noun out of the verb denoting the doer of the action described in the verb. In this case, the ER indicates one or someone who plays. It is a bound morpheme since ER cannot be used all on its own. Finally, we have the S. This is the plural marker in English, and it also is a bound morpheme. So players has three distinct morphemes which make up the word, play plus ER plus S. Each one of these morphemes has both function and meaning. For something to be language, regardless of where or by whom spoken, it must contain morphemes. They are the bits and pieces that create language itself. Sounds are put together and are used to create morphemes. Without morphemes, you don't have language. It's just that simple. You have to have bits and pieces of speech that have an actual assigned meaning to them. The same meaning has to hold true for all occurrences of that particular morpheme. This speaks to the first feature that all languages must contain, discrete units of various sorts. These discrete units are the morphemes of language. The second feature of language are rules and principles that govern the way these discrete units can be combined and ordered. All languages have some type of grammar, grammar being simply an agreed-upon way in which these discrete units or morphemes are put together to make cohesive, intelligible words and subsequently phrases and sentences. Part of this grammar also involves an agreed-upon way in which to order these words or phrases. This is known as syntax. In examining T-speech, we find that it does not contain any of the above features. You cannot write a sentence down in T-speech and break the words down into individual morphemes. T-speech not only does not contain morphemes, it does not have any principles or rules by which the sounds are ordered, and without these, you don't have language. Further, a given morpheme in a language has to have the same meaning such that the meaning has to hold true for all occurrences of that particular morpheme. A morpheme cannot have several different meanings. What do I mean by this? Well, in T-speech, if one were to record a sample and play it to several people who interpret tongues, one would get several different interpretations, typically totally different and unrelated to each other. Occasionally, some similarities may be noted between interpretations, but given the religious context and genericness of the interpretations, occasional similarity or overlap is to be expected. Language simply does not work that way. You can't have multiple meanings or interpretations for the same sentence. As someone once commented, Pentecostal Darwinism does not exist. You can't have multiple meanings to justify an obvious discrepancy. You can, however, certainly have subtleties that change the nuance of what's being said, but the big brown dog is slow can never be the small white cat is quick, which is what happens frequently with T-speech with respect to multiple interpretations for the same glossic string. Further, another complicating issue is that of the interpretation of any given utterance. It is typically inordinately longer than the actual glossic string. There are indeed languages in the world where one word can often translate into an entire sentence in English, but an entire paragraph or two, or sometimes even three, simply does not happen in language. Without getting into details here, many will argue that T-speech and its subsequent interpretation are two totally different and unrelated phenomena. Now, on the subject of the same word, different meanings, as some may point out, many languages contain homophones and homonyms. Just to quickly review here, homophones are words that sound alike and are spelt alike but have two separate meanings. For example, in English, fair, F-A-I-R, meaning reasonable, fair in the sense of a county fair, and fair as in light color. She is fair-haired or fair-skinned, etc. Homonyms, like homophones, sound alike and have separate meanings, but in this case, they are spelt completely different. So, for example, in English, pear, P-A-I-R, usually two of something, and pear, P-E-A-R, the fruit. In these cases, the meaning of the word in question is derived from context, that is, the other words around it. So the argument here being, well, why can't T-speech work the same way with respect to multiple meanings for the same glossic element? Let's take an example of T-speech that I recently transcribed from a pastor. The sequence is as follows. Kese misha driasai, kese misha driasai, kese misha driasai. So here we have the same glossic string repeated 3 times. Let's take the glossic element misha. Let's just say, for the sake of this exercise, that this element can carry multiple meanings. Let's say X, Y, or Z. Again, for the sake of argument in this exercise, whether these 3 meanings are interpreted as one word or as 2 long paragraphs is irrelevant. Taking a look at our glossic utterance, we see that our word misha occurs in the exact same context in all 3 strings. Thus, its meaning or interpretation in all 3 instances must be the same. Let's just say in the first string, based on the context, that is, occurring after the word kese and directly before the word driasai, it is interpreted as X. Since it also occurs in this exact same context in the following 2 strings, the way language works is that it would dictate that for these other 2 strings, misha must also be interpreted as X. Moreover, since we have the exact same words in the exact same context in order for all 3 strings, each of these 3 strings should be interpreted the exact same way. In T-speech, however, this is just not the case. Our word misha, even though it occurs in the exact same context in all 3 strings, is frequently interpreted as X, Y, or Z, not just one of the 3. Furthermore, each one of the 3 strings, even though they contain the exact same words in the exact same order, can be interpreted as 3 completely different things. Moreover, if this were given to another person who interprets tongues, one would typically get yet 3 additional, totally different interpretations of these same 3 strings. What is also quite common is that some people will mix their native language with their T-speech, so you end up with a macaronic text of sorts, half in T-speech and half in, say, English. What is absolutely astonishing is that when glossic utterance such as these are interpreted, The interpreter does not repeat or include the parts said in English at all. It should all flow together, not be totally ignored or dispensed with. It's almost comical, really, because you're waiting to hear the interpreter repeat the English used by the speaker, but it just never happens. Yet another piece of evidence that T-speech and interpretation, though used hand in hand, are two entirely different phenomena. Language, no matter where or by whom spoken, just doesn't work like that. To suggest that it does, or that it might, would make it fail on even the simplest definition and criteria of what communication and language consists of. If one were to imagine a purely hypothetical situation just for the purpose of this exercise, an alien craft lands and beings emerge and begin speaking to humans in a language which no one on Earth has ever heard before. That language, even though completely alien, literally, will contain morphemes, a grammar, and although we might not have the physical ability to reproduce them, phonemes. The morphemes and grammar may be completely alien, no pun intended, to our way of thinking, but they will be there nonetheless. These things are universal to language. Even the meowing patterns of cats, the songs of the humpback whale, and the dancing patterns of honeybees, as alien as they may seem to us, all conform to the criteria of communication with respect to a single general meaning assigned to a specific pattern. T-speech just does not have this. You can't have several, often distinctly different meanings for the same utterance. To do so negates the need for T-speech in the first place. Lastly, as mentioned above, there are no two tongues that are exactly alike. Each one is unique to the individual speaker. Oftentimes, speakers report being able to produce several different tongues, thus claiming to have the ability to speak in diverse tongues. But this is just the subconscious drawing upon a different subset of phonemes. The same set isn't always used every time a person speaks tongues. For some speakers, it's rather random, and thus it is perceived as a totally different tongue. That said, there's definitely a lot of copying of particular phrases or words that well-known pastors use that speakers will either consciously or unconsciously pick up on and copy, particularly with the advent of the internet. One that I hear frequently is kishanda, which I would argue is simply derived from a corrupted pronunciation of the English word Sunday. This copying of certain words between speakers has become so common with the advent of the computer age and the internet that the words have almost become standardized. It's rather common to hear them. It is noted that most of these copied words are usually used to initiate a glossic string, which begs the question of whether speakers are using this to initiate or jumpstart a glossic utterance, rather than coming up with their own way to initiate it. In some Pentecostal and charismatic circles, this jumpstarting a glossic string by beginning with a set word is known as priming the pump. This copying of words and phrases, and I use the term rather loosely when referring to T-speech, is so common in some parishes that almost all the people in a particular parish will sound somewhat similar in their production of T-speech. People are simply copying and learning from each other. This is also how younger children will produce their T-speech. For the most part, they're just copying and mimicking what they hear all around them. Another rarer element of T-speech is the corrupting of actual words in the speaker's native language to fit syllable and sound structure of that speaker's T-speech. For example, a speaker from Australia whose T-speech was studied and transcribed used a good bit of smattering of rather obviously corrupted English words in his T-speech. Phrases in T-speech are often interdispersed with praise phrases in the speaker's native language. It's not uncommon to hear a speaker say things like, "Praise Jesus," "Hallelujah," "In Jesus' name," etc., while engaged in T-speech. Hebrew terms and phrases are also not uncommonly heard. These include words such as Mashiach, Yeshua, Yahweh, Adonai, etc. This usage seems to lend to the authenticity of the supposed language. Given all the above factors, there is simply no way to argue for modern tongues as language. The tongues Pentecostal and charismatic Christians are producing today is an entirely self-created phenomenon. It is non-cognitive, non-language utterance, random free vocalization, the subconscious playing with the sounds to create what is perceived and interpreted as actual, meaningful speech. With respect to the possibility of tongues being an actual language spoken somewhere on earth, there are, as many people point out, thousands of languages in the world, even ancient ones that are no longer spoken. How do we know that tongues isn't one of these thousands of languages? Well, it's rather straightforward. By the same criteria as described above. And yes, there are indeed thousands of languages spoken in the world today, but honestly, not one of them is remotely close to what people are producing in their glossolalia or tongues. As one linguist, a Dr. Welmers, puts it, among us linguists, we have heard many hundreds of languages. Furthermore, we have heard representative languages in virtually every group of related languages in the world and have studied at least one representative of related languages from every group of related languages in the modern and ancient world. At worst, we may have missed a few small groups in some of the more remote parts of the world. I would estimate that the chances are at least even that if a glossic utterance was in a known language, one of us would either recognize the language or recognize that it is similar to some language we are acquainted with, modern or ancient. In short, it may take a while, but the language would be able to be specifically identified. Dr. Welmers further makes this challenge. Get two recordings, one of a glossic utterance, and the other in a real language remote from anything I have ever heard. I'm confident that in just a few moments I could tell which is which and why I'm sure of it. As a linguist, I completely concur with this challenge. Real language is unmistakable, as is glossolalia or T-speech. On a more esoteric note, and one can either take this or leave it, if tongues are supposed to be some universal heavenly language, why would there ever be need for more than just one, rather than countless thousands, one unique one per speaker? This seems to completely defeat the purpose of a heavenly tongue, and it certainly negates, as some people believe, some sort of reversal of Babel. One could argue that tongues, being a heavenly language, does not need to have, nor does it need to meet all the criteria described above. It's a heavenly language after all, and it does not need to be bound by any human definitions of language. You're trying to analyze something spiritual or supernatural in earthly terms. The constraints and criteria described further above are, as mentioned, universal. And I can't stress that enough. If an entity, be it a human being or a heavenly being, utters a string of sounds and wants to call it language, those sounds must have some type of structure which define them and assign them meaning, morphemic structure, grammar, syntax, etc. Otherwise, it's just not language. It simply amounts to free vocalization produced by the subconscious, non-cognitive, non-language utterance, the best working and most accurate description of modern T-speech. Without getting into further lengthy discussions, in all cases where the Bible talks about tongues as something spoken, it is simply a reference to real rational language. There is nothing in those passages that cannot be explained in the context of real language. I would even argue that in some cases, given the context of the situation, It's much easier to understand the passage in terms of real language than it is in terms of the modern concept of tongues. Quite frankly, modern tongues are simply not what those that speak them perceive, want, or even need them to be. Are they a tool by which a person can establish a closer relationship with the divine and thus strengthen their spiritual path? Can their usage even aid in the physical or spiritual healing process? To both questions, yes, absolutely. I would argue that this is done in both Christian and non-Christian usage on a daily basis. It must be noted, however, that the use of this tool is highly dependent on one's faith. The two go hand in hand. Tongues, or glossolalia, cannot correctly be used without faith, no matter what religious path that faith may encompass. For many, both Christians and non-Christians alike, glossolalia is in fact a very powerful tool. Are they a heavenly angelic language, or a language spoken somewhere on earth? Indeed, are they even language? No, they are not. Tongues are completely self-created, whether speakers are consciously aware of it or not. As such, though many are quite interesting from a linguistic perspective, they are neither mysterious nor are they divine. For a further discussion on tongues, I refer you to the link at the bottom of the video description. I certainly welcome your comments, but let's keep them civil. If applicable, I will try and answer as many as I can, time allowing. Thanks for watching.